Good afternoon,
Good
everyone.
afternoon, everyone. I was checking on the numbers as people are coming in. I see we're getting slowly. Thank you for coming and joining us on the second pillar of our Futures Conference. Today, the pillar is science, and we have two very well-known speakers with us today. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Enedina Vasquez, and co-hosting today with me is Tammy Hughes. And our two speakers, first we have Luis Vasquez speaking. Dr. Luis Vasquez is a Regents Professor Emeritus at New Mexico State University. He has a long history of working with NMSU, New Mexico State University, in a variety of roles and capacities, as from faculty to Associate Dean of the Grad School to Associate Vice President for Research, and has received many different accolades as part of his work at New Mexico State University. He's also received grants from the National Science Foundation, Kellogg Foundation, Ford Foundation, and has served with various agencies in helping underrepresented students and research. He's been a panel reviewer for the National Science Foundation as well, always working to focus on research that empowers underrepresented student populations in education. Dr. Vasquez is a member of the American Psych Association and has served in many committees, including the Council of Representative on behalf of Division 45, the psychological study of culture, ethnicity, and race. He's been a past president also of Division 45 and has chaired the board for the advancement of psychology in the public interest as well. Thank you, Dr. Vasquez, for joining us today. We really look forward to your presentation. Our second presenter is Dr. Tamika LaSalle Finley, and she is an associate professor at Georgia State University and the director of the Center of Research on School Safety, School Climate, and Classroom Management. She also serves as editor-in-chief for the International Journal of School and Educational Psychology. Dr. LaSalle Finley's research focuses on the intersection of cultural factors and students' educational experiences to improve equitable outcomes for marginalized students. She recently published the edited book, Creating an Inclusive School Climate, a School Psychology Model for Supporting Marginalized Students. We're going to go ahead and get started. We'll have Dr. Vasquez present first, and Dr. LaSalle Finley will speak second, and then we'll hold for questions at the end of their presentations. Dr. Vasquez.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Vasquez. And let me get started. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. And here we go. It is very exciting here. And I want to make sure everyone can see this. Okay, everyone can see my my PowerPoint? Yes?
Yes.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, just want to make sure. Okay, so today's session, what I really want to let you know is that we're advancing science by minimizing bias, the psychology of knowing. And why did I pick that? And how is it that we're going to be able to go forward and be able to be the best scholars as possible, the best practitioners possible as school psychologists and so forth? I'm going to share a little tiny bit of my history, which will tell you why I believe and feel the way I do. So when I first started school, I only spoke Spanish. Nobody knew what to do with me. This was 1962, so I'm aging myself a little bit here. And when I spoke Spanish, the teachers would look at me and didn't know what to do with me. So I got put in this classroom with many others, those that were helmets, those were in wheelchairs, those that all spoke other languages. And we were called the special classroom. See, back there in 1962, special education did not exist. So what they did was, and able to train us to learn and to speak English even, they tested us. And I was diagnosed as educationally mentally handicapped, and that has stayed with me throughout my whole life. Every time we spoke Spanish, we were punished. We would take it to the front of the classroom and grab our ankles, and they gave us a little swat with the Board of Education for us to be able to understand and learn. And so I didn't know English. None of the teachers or any of the professionals at the school knew Spanish, and we were punished into learning. And what was supposed to be taken from me never happened, because yo todavía hablo español como si fuera mi primer idioma. I still speak Spanish as if it was my first language. And so what do we need to know as researchers? How do we work with children? And by the way, that diagnosis saved me even through middle school and high school, where I ended up only taking vocational courses and no college prep, except for math, which was the only thing I really learned. So let's get started, because I want to start you with, how do we begin to learn and work with our biases and use that for research? I have all of my students learn this, so I'm going to share it with you. It's called the conscious competence theory of learning, a new skill. What does that mean? Well, many of us don't know. We're unaware. For instance, when you go work with populations, we're unaware what's diverse, what language, and so forth. But I am willing to bet that when you go home and you bring friends home, you tell your friends, now, when my grandfather walks in, stay away from this. And when my mom serves you, never say no, because you're supposed to eat whatever they give you. And you know all these cultural rules. How did you learn that? Because you grow up with them. You learn the rules, just like you go somewhere else and you visit others, you learn the rules. So you're very unaware of the skills and the lack of proficiency. Some people call that ignorance. And so you go around the world. So when you meet others, you think they're just like me, and they'll think like me, and they'll be like me, and they're going to want to do things that I do. And then it hits you that you get this, what I call conscious incompetence. You're aware of the skill, but not yet proficient. I've met people that are starting to learn Spanish, and they'll say, El Troco went to the barro, and then went, and I understand very little what they're saying, but they're trying, which is a good thing. But they're not proficient yet, and they're learning a new skill, and they're discovering there's rules for elders, there's rules that you communicate. There's a real collective sense of being versus being an individualist. There's that rugged, pull yourself up by your bootstraps that Maine America always looks at. But you can't do that if you're barefoot. And so when you begin to look at all these things, you start to tell yourself, I am becoming aware that I'm not the only being in this world, and there's a lot around me. There's different languages, there's different cultures, there's different cultural rules. And in research, we have the same thing. There's a lot of differences when we're working with diverse populations in research. So what do? We begin to learn a new skill. And that means, like, for instance, we take the RB practice and so forth to learn what not to do. Benevolence, benefiting others, do no harm. What are your most vulnerable populations? But does anybody tell you how to communicate with them? No. Does anybody tell you what to do when you go to the community? For instance, if you go to the colonias here and you're dealing with migrants, then the average education rate is about 8th grade. How do you get consent? What does that mean? How do the people understand? Do you need a cultural broker? Does somebody else have to teach you the rules? And then you start to learn that, oh my gosh, you're able to use it. You need to learn some of these skills, which leads us to mastery, unconscious competence. You learn a process on how to learn, and that helps you move forward. And that's very, very important, because then you decide, oh my gosh, this is becoming secondhand. I know how to be vulnerable. I know how to understand. So how do you do that? And how can our advisors and our faculty take us there? Here are the 4 stages I just went through. You go from ignorance to awareness to learning to mastery. So this is why I had all of you, and I hope you all did this, take these instruments, implicit bias, because that's something that's ingrained in the brain. You learn, it's conditioned to you throughout your life. Emotional intelligence, the ability to perceive, use, understand, manage, and handle emotions. What does that mean? The emotions come right through the back into your limbic system here and come into your front where you rationalize this. And for some of us, our emotions get stuck right here, and whatever we're thinking comes out of our mouth without ever saying or thinking, oh my gosh, what did I just do? So in cultural intelligence, do we have knowledge of the hidden rules of the populations that we're working with, whether it be linguistic, whether it be cultural, whether it be an intersectionality of identities that the kids bring, the parents bring? Is the school open to a sense of belonging? Do you feel like that environment's really for you? And what does that mean? These are the different websites for each of these instruments. And I've been told that you all took these instruments and put together a little profile. So I'm going to ask you questions at the end to see how well and what you learned from taking these instruments. So what's implicit bias? Individual experience and social conditioning, plus how the brain works. What does that mean? Unconscious bias. You walk into an elevator and people of color will walk in and you'll all of a sudden put your hand on your wallet on the back for mat, or you grab your purse and hold it in. Or you're walking down the street and all of a sudden you hear the different languages. And guess what? You really believe that everybody's talking about you. It has nothing to do with you, but you're going, oh my gosh, they're speaking in a different language. They must be talking about me. I'm sorry, sometimes we're not that important. But anyway, and so all these are little learned traits. Like, for instance, if you're poor and you're born poor into a poor family, then that's your own fault. And that's what you have to deal with. But that's your parents' fault. Not that the environment and discriminatory practices have left you out of a society that you could be a part of. Nope, it's on you. I also had you take the political ideology. And this is to see how conservative you are and how liberal you are, or how moderate you are, and very liberal and very conservative. Why is that important? Well, the unconscious bias tells you, and that's the implicit bias, that when you read or start to do research, you begin to work from that perspective and never pay attention to the actual culture of the people, the language, what they bring to the table, and how that interacts with you. The political ideology tells you if you're very conservative, you might have strong religious belief one way or the other, or you might be super liberal. You might be in the middle and go both ways. Why is that important? Because I've worked with studies where we've actually helped parents with parent effectiveness training, and guess what happened? When we did the training, we got funded by the government, by the state. The liberals said, oh, this is tremendous. We learned a lot. And a lot of the parents that were liberal said, oh my gosh. Other very conservative politicians said, see, now psychologists are trying to tell you how to raise your kid. So that's why they make you go through this. That complete interpretation was from liberal to positive to conservative and back and forth. And so how you interpret data, it's not so much that you actually do the research and you do it right. Now you have to be able to interpret the results that you have. Your political ideology and your implicit bias play a major role in that. So then, emotional intelligence, how does that tie into everything? The emotional intelligence ties in because it helps you with your decision making. It allows you to stay calm and not get so stressed and actually begin to understand what is going on here. Why are we feeling the way we do? What can we do to communicate better? Where are these feelings coming from? Where did they originate? How do I hold myself accountable? How do I become flexible? And as you can see, the emotional tree of life, as your emotional IQ increases, so does your ability to work with others and your expansion of how you feel about things, how you work with things. And when you combine that with getting rid of a lot of your implicit bias, and when you combine that with actually knowing what your political ideology is, you develop and begin, and you're well on your way to cultural intelligence. How can I adapt? Knowledge. How is this similar to my own experiences? How do I know? How do I know? Strategy. How can I plan? Action. How do I behave? I've seen students and faculty that want to go and do research with Native Americans, and they'll go to the res and we'll be there, and they all of a sudden show up, and I go, did you go to the Navajo IRB in Tucson, Arizona? Did you talk to the tribal council? Did you get special permission? And they said, but none of that was in the IRB. What do you mean we have to do that? Or they'll go to the colonias where everybody speaks Spanish. How did you do your consent form? It's in English. You have a cultural broker that can interpret. Are you going to audio tape it and say it in Spanish? Are you going to have somebody audio, video, and so forth? How do you know when you have consent? How do you know when you have consent? Oh my gosh. And then yet people sit there and go, I don't know. And when you do research, is it just to gather data? Or will you be giving back to the community that you actually gathered data from? And what are you doing with that? It's fascinating when the researchers, faculty, and students look at me and with this bewilderment in their eyes going, I don't know. Which leads us to, how do you communicate? How do you communicate with the populations that you work with? Now, remember, you have to deal with your implicit bias. Okay, now we took the instrument and then we have implicit bias. Okay, now I can see where some of my gaps are. Political ideology. How conservative or liberal am I, or moderate am I? And how does that impact the decisions you make in your daily life? And how does that impact the decisions that you will make in research and your results? And then you have your emotional intelligence. How do I compromise, exchange, and work, and be able to work with these different things when they come together? And what does that mean? And my cultural intelligence. What do I do? How do I interpret? I spent 13 years working in Native ceremonies with the natives, with the Native American populations, Navajo, Lakota, Pueblo, and Apache. I also spent a lot of times with different religions here, whether it be Mormon, Lutheran, Irish Catholic, Spanish Catholic, Black Baptist, White Baptist. I learned a lot from all of them. What am I now? I'm still a Catholic, but more of a Spanish Catholic or Mexican American Catholic in my beliefs. But I learned and expanded my knowledge. I also ran groups with the GLBTQ+ when I was at the University of Iowa. Groups that I ran an AIDS support group. And so we learn how to say goodbye, how to grieve, how to understand, how to share, and how to create a sense of belonging. I also work with the LGBTQ group at the University of Iowa to the personnel officers and working alliances. I also work closely with the Black Student Union and became very, very, very close with many of the students, and also in the Chicano Native American Center. But I sought these experiences out because I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn about others. So when we look at how we communicate, that's how we communicate. 38% is tone inflection. 55% is body language, but only 7% are the words that you use to communicate with others. In my research classes, this is where we start from. We look at implicit bias. We look at political ideology. We look at emotional intelligence. We look at culture intelligence. And each student develops their own profile, and then we relate it to the kind of research they want to do, how they want to do this research, what it is that they need to do to understand it better, and what it is that we need to do as professors and advisors to help them through that process. See, it's a process of learning. It's a process of learning, and then learning how to communicate. So let me take you back to the very beginning here. And the very beginning is, we start from unconscious incompetence, go to conscious competence, go to conscious competence and learning. So we go from ignorance, awareness, learning to mastery. What does mastery mean? You never stop learning, but you're always adding on, and you're always getting better and better as you continue in your search and how you interpret results, how you work with different populations. So it's really about learning, a process of learning to do the best you can with those who are linguistically, culturally diverse, and those that are in your universe. Because as school psychologists, you will touch on all these things. And all these things will also help you develop critical thinking skills. And when people do studies and you look at the results and say, could have been interpreted a different way. What does this mean? How does this compare? What does this look like? And within that cultural context, do the people from that context see it the same way? Or do we really miss the interpretation because of our biases? So I want to leave you with this. At the end, I hope that when we get to the questions, that you will share with us what you learned from taking these instruments and how do you think you can apply these, not only to yourself, to your research, to your practice, and what is it that you need to work on to be the best school psychologist that's able to work with many populations, and what you don't know, you can learn. I want to thank you for this time, and I do appreciate sharing with you. And so I'm going to stop my sharing now. And I know that our next person will be talking. So I look forward to your questions at the end. Thank you.
Right, I will jump right in. Thank you, Dr. Vasquez. That was really great. I'm going to talk about science and scholarship. And Dr. Vasquez has already gone over the objectives in terms of essentially how can we have scholarship that advances diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm going to be talking about it from my perspective as an editor. I am an editor of IJSCP, International Journal of School and Educational Psychology. This is my third year. And so again, I'll talk about my perspective from an editor and also a little bit just from the work that I do, which is based around school climate and creating cultural contexts that are responsive to the needs of students. And so there are a number of journals just in school psychology, then of course, outside of school psychology and the whole education field. And so I'm speaking broadly around recommendations. I can talk about how I think about being an editor of a journal and advancing scholarship, but it could vary across journals. But I do think that as a whole, as a field, it is our goal to advance research around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I hope that what I talk about today can be move us forward in that direction. So some barriers. When we think about publishing research around topics that historically in school psychology have not been published a lot, around Black and Brown populations, around critical race theory, around centering the experiences of students with marginalized identities, there's some different barriers. So one of those is, what is the value that's placed on different research methods? So thinking about quantitative analysis versus qualitative analysis and mixed methods analysis. I consider myself heavily quant, but for a long time in the field, we were primarily quantitative focused. And so there are many qualitative researchers that really had a challenge publishing their research. And when you really want to tell people stories in a comprehensive way, that usually is through qualitative or mixed methods. And there can be limitations there. And so I think, again, as a field, we move forward in that direction, but it has created a barrier when you think about what are the research methods that are used and what's the value that's placed on them. I engage now in more mixed methods research, and even by default, I can get caught up in this cycle of like, oh, we're going to do 7 interviews, or should we do 52 interviews? Like, why would we do 52 interviews for qualitative research? But you can get caught up in that cycle of thinking in this quantitative frame because that's what's been valued the most. And so that's one of the things that I think can be a barrier. The areas of the expertise of reviewers. And so, peer-reviewed research is just that, it's peer-reviewed. And so we're looking to our colleagues to our left and our right to be able to provide feedback around the quality of our scholarship. And while we consider that a benefit, it can also be a challenge, right? And so that goes back to who is reviewing your work. Is their feedback helpful, fair, relevant? I've put out research and work where people are coming back with questions that really makes it clear that they're not familiar with this area of research. And so that makes it really challenging because you can feel defensive, like you have to defend yourself, right, against someone who isn't really knowledgeable about that area of research. So it's, as an editor, what's really important to me is who makes up our editorial board. And when we're assigning associate editors and when we're assigning editorial review board members, we're being really thoughtful about who that is. There's an asterisk there because right now it's difficult to get reviewers. I mean, we're all taxed and we're all tired, right? And so there are many times we're saying we're hoping to get reviewers. And so sometimes we become a little bit more lax in who we're asking to review manuscripts, but we really try to be intentional and making sure that, that's why it's so important to update your area of expertise when you are reviewers, so that when we're selecting reviewers, we can select reviewers whose areas are aligned with that of the manuscript. But again, that becomes really challenging because when you're publishing in novel areas or in novel ways, then you're tapping into a lot of times areas where that group is really, really small. The other challenge that I've seen is the areas of as young faculty or graduate students, the areas of co-authors and advisors. And so if my topic, if I want to do something around a specific group or a marginalized group, and that's not the expertise of my author or my advisor or co-author, then that can compromise the quality of the manuscript, right? And so it can be a really good research question. It could be a really good topic. But if I don't have the mentorship, then I can't bring it into fruition. And then it feels like this work is not valued because it doesn't meet the standards of the journal. And so I think that becomes really, really important. And unfortunately, what happens in our field is there are only a few people who do that work. And so then you have to go outside your university or you have to look elsewhere, and that can be challenging, right? And so that definitely is a barrier in that, you know, more of us want to do this work and should be doing this work, but there are limitations around who's actually doing the work and who can actually advise the work. Another barrier is page limits. That goes back to even like the quant versus qual versus mixed methods research. And oftentimes there's these page limits. And even as a quantitative researcher, when I'm doing survey analyses or survey validation, then it becomes really long, that manuscript. You know, for our journal, Taylor and Francis has moved from a model of counting page numbers to just having like a certain number of manuscripts per issue, especially with things moving online. And so it allows for more flexibility with publishing when I don't have to say, okay, you're maxed out at 6,000 words. For a qualitative paper, that's nothing, right? And so I think that's us thinking more creatively about how research is disseminated, how it's published. Moving from print to online allows a little bit more flexibility, at least through some journals, and remove some of the barriers that come along with page limits. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few. The other piece, I think this one's redundant, is thinking about other barriers around, actually, I'll come back to that, sorry. The other piece that becomes important is being responsible when you represent the narratives of researchers. So one, thinking about a phenomenological perspective, really making sure that you're considering the perspective of the people that you're doing research with, not on. And I think that is a challenge, right? And so one is, I say allow research objective space to breathe. And so what I mean by that is not being so focused on your original research question that you fail to let the research take its own shape, right? So we did a mixed method study. We're looking at student perceptions of school climate, particularly among Black students. And we have research questions, use a semi-structured interview, but there are other narratives that emerged. And so I think that sometimes we feel like in order to get it into this journal, in order to align ourselves in this way, that we have to only publish what we saw somebody else publish, or we have to only publish what someone else has mentioned. And I think it's really important to let the people you're researching with, hopefully with, not on, tell their story and let the story breathe a little bit and be open to allowing that to happen. There's a difference between changing your hypothesis and authentically following the narrative of the data. Right. And so I think that becomes really, really important. And again, sometimes we could become rigid in our thinking because we're thinking I have to submit to this journal, or, well, this has already been published, so I know that this can be published, or I'm just replicating this. And so I really think that it's really important to be able to be flexible in that. The other piece is when you're representing research is to think about the use of words. Words matter. A lot, especially when we're writing things that are going to be there for a long time. And so use language intentionally and responsibly. And so for me, that comes down to being responsible about who's on your research teams, right? So if you're doing research around populations, specific populations, students with marginalized identities, then it's important that your research team is balanced in a way that provides this kind of checks and balances, right? Are we using language responsibly? Are we representing the groups in the light that is fair to them, in the light that is authentic to them? The caveat, one time what happened to me is a research group noted, right, their bias in saying the group that we're representing or that we're writing about is different from our research group, right? Like we're not as diverse as a research group, but we've done this work and we would like for the reviewers to be able to provide us feedback. Like, that's not fair. That's actually kind of selfish because, you have to be responsible with your research and with your research team. And so if you're choosing a topic that is not within your area of expertise and you're not bringing in people who have that area of expertise, then it can be a bit irresponsible, right? If I conduct this whole study without a checks and balances and then rely on the reviewers to be able to tell me what should I be adding or what should I be doing differently. The question then is, are you really doing authentic research? Is that work that you should really be doing? And so I caution you that sometimes we can fall into wanting to do work that we think the data is available for, or we have access to. But if we're not doing it in a responsible way, then we really become, it really becomes problematic, because then you become reliant and end up taxing people in the field who are doing that work in ways that are unfair. And so just being responsible about who's on your team and using the resources within your team to enhance your research. Some considerations when you think about journal selection, I get it. Like, it's a balancing act between, deciding where you publish, depending on your university, depending on tenure, depending on a number of factors. You want to publish in places that have a high impact factor. You want to publish in places that are going to get you tenure. And so I think that it's a balancing act. And I think that part of that is being mindful about where you've opted to work, right? And so there are some balances where you're looking at what's the value that's placed on research here, right? Some journals target certain areas, some journals target other areas. There's the journal impact, and then there's the journal impact, right? So the impact factor versus the impact in terms of, are you trying to reach academics and practitioners and teachers? And this is something I've worked through in my own professional career. My recommendation to you is to, again, balance it out. And you can have aspirational journals that you're saying, I really want to publish here, but I would also make sure that you feel like the research that you're able to publish there is aligned with your actual goals, and that you don't have to change it so much that when you read the article, you're like, did I write that? Because it's been transformed so much to fit into that journal. I think that you can balance between what we consider high impact journals and practitioner friendly journals, particularly if you're being considerate about the audiences that you want to reach, especially if you're trying to advance research in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The other piece that I want to talk about for a second is, when you think about research considerations, be mindful about who are your reference groups. Do you have to have one? I did this a lot in my research, especially when I was establishing the school climate surveys, comparing the experiences of students with disabilities to students without disabilities, or comparing the experiences of Black students to non-Black students. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second while I talk about this. Comparing the experiences of students with disabilities and not disabilities. And so what I think is, sometimes we fall into this trap of comparing students because we want to be able to say, well, how similar or dissimilar are their experiences? And, I caution us all, because we don't always have to do that. I mean, the question is, how beneficial is that? Right? Like, do I need to do that? And one of my perspectives on that is, when I compare, for example, the experiences of Black students to white students, I actually expect for their experiences to be different, right? I expect for them to be equitable, but I expect for them to be different. And so when I'm comparing and I say Black students have higher perceptions of school climate than white students, like, what does that actually mean? What do we do with that, right? I can write a whole paper just talking about these descriptives, but how does that actually advance things forward? What does that actually mean if that's my only contribution? And in many cases, I'm really just reiterating things that we already know. And so instead, right, there's a shift in focus of centering the experiences of Black students, or looking at the experiences of Black students and Black students with disabilities, and looking within that group, right? And understanding, okay, I understand the experience of students with Black students and Black students with disabilities. And maybe I'm looking within that group to say, there are particular challenges that Black students have. And then what is the additive impact of having a disability? Really that intersectional focus, disability within the context of school. And so I caution us all to think about that. Again, I've had to be mindful of that in my own research around who are who am I comparing students to, and what is the value that we have there? And I think that oftentimes we do that because it's the default, right? We consider comparing students to the default group. My question is, like, how additive is that? Is that really? All right, let me go back to sharing my screen. I said this earlier, research with populations versus on populations. And again, that goes back to, again, being mindful about who your research team is and being thoughtful about that. At the end of the day, it is my mindset, and maybe this is year 11 talking, maybe not year 1, so take it with caution. But I think that, I think at the end of the day, you change the journal, you don't change your research, because if you have research that is sound, if you have research that is relevant, particular to certain communities, then it's going to get disseminated and it's going to get read, because people will follow you and they will follow your work. And I think that becomes far more important than where your work is. Again, I put an asterisk earlier. I'm tenure track. I understand that, like, there's a balancing act. But what I have found through the years is that people will follow your work. And when they go to Google Scholar and they Google this topic, it's going to come up. And so if you feel like you have to change it so much so where it's changing certain words, or changing, or someone will say, why don't you add this reference group? If that doesn't feel authentic to your work, then don't do it. There are several journals that will be happy to publish your work as is. And I think that you have to make those decisions. A couple of different recommendations. Research different journals. Look for those that are aligned with the goals that you intend, with your goals and intended impact. Again, I talked about higher tier journals. Reach out to the editor, but I say this sometimes because I think that, people reach out to me and say, oops, what happened? Oh, people reach out to me and will say, will you accept this manuscript? Are you interested in this? And I can say, yes, like, this seems like a topic that's interested. I think that, be mindful about that, because I don't know, in many cases, unless it's a topic that's not aligned with the aims and the goals of the journal, that doesn't mean that it's going to be accepted. And so I think that, reaching out to the editor, sometimes it's more helpful to look at what's been published in the journal already, what types of papers, how are the papers formatted? Or you might say, well, nothing's been, published here. I want to be the pilot for this journal. I want to spearhead this. That's great too. But sometimes we don't want to do that. We want to send our work in places where we already know that it's valued and don't want to have to pave the way, though paving the way is great too. And I said this already, if you value research and contribution, don't change it. The last thing I want to talk about are just my own lessons learned when I think about my own research journey and some reflections. One is getting stuck in comparative research, like I talked about before, and the default to using reference groups. Again, I think it's different when we're talking about how trying to understand different students' experiences and using that to support students. But early on, there was a default where I would say, well, this score is higher than this score is higher than this. And that, you get to the end, you get the discussion, and you say, what is the purpose of that? Where, again, I expect for students with disabilities to have different experiences than students with disabilities or without disabilities. Equitable, right? But like, that doesn't mean that they're going to be the same, because they do need different supports and they do start off at different points. And so I think that that is one of the areas where, I caution you to think about. Feeling like I didn't have enough space to tell the full story because of page limits, because of the methodology used, or having to over-explain, thinking, well, I'll write this in the next journal, or I'll put this in the next journal. Tell your story now. Tell it in the manuscript that you're writing. And again, manuscripts have shifted a little bit with respect to page numbers, or you can write, when you're submitting articles, usually it'll say, if it exceeds this word limit, then provide an explanation. Provide that explanation and let it go. Don't let, 100 or 800 or 900 words stop you from submitting to that journal. Write a rationale and give it a try, because sometimes you end up cutting so much that it tells a different story. And then the last piece that I talked about is worrying too much about the journal. Again, I really think that it's a balancing act and thinking about where you want your work to be showcased. And I think that, for me, it's important for practitioners to have access to the work. It's important from an international perspective. And so I think that when you're making decisions about journals, that you should keep that in mind, knowing that, based on your university, that there are certain qualifications, but also remembering that there are a number of journals within school psychology and beyond school psychology that would beautifully display your work just the way it is without having to change it. All right, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you. We're going to check to see if there's some questions. I don't see any questions. Tammy, how do we handle? Oh, here we have one. Is school psychology ready for community-based participatory CBO? Are we ready to send our kids and let them lead? What do you think, Dr. LaSalle?
I think yes. I think definitely. I think that, again, I think that might look differently depending on what your research looks like. But for, if I'm talking for myself, a lot of my early research was around establishing methods to examine perceptions of school climate. And that has extended now to more mixed methods where we have the methods and we have the quantitative piece. But now we're doing semi-structured interviews, moving towards focus groups to be able to have students tell the stories about how they feel about the school environment. And for them to be able to tell me, what am I missing? Like quantitatively, this scale fits, but like, where am I missing things? Like what's beyond the margins? And so I do think that it means providing opportunities, but to be a responsible researcher, it also means me reading up on mixed methods research, looking at coursework and just doing it responsibly, not just adding in mixed methods research and calling myself a mixed methods researcher. And so I definitely think that there are opportunities, but I think we have to be responsible in understanding like our skills and making sure that we're learning the appropriate skills to be able to conduct that research.
Thank you. Dr. Vasquez, did you want to respond?
I was just going to say that when I had the Enlace grant, I'm not so sure not all schools and all areas are ready, because when I did the work with the public schools on the border here, it was fascinating to see the rules they had and who they let you talk to and not talk to, how the principals are very protective, the superintendents. So you really have to develop really strong relationships to do that kind of research, because when I had the Enlace grant, a $1.3 million grant by Catalog to develop parent centers within the school and how those parent centers would work and how that would impact the overall retention and success of students, that was not going very well for the schools. It was fascinating about the protectiveness by some of the professionals. The parents couldn't wait to get into the schools and creating that balancing act between the parents, the students, teachers, and the administration, and how to balance that out to be able to do what I would call consensual research that would involve the participatory research across the populations to see what could be the best done in order to get the answers necessary to try to change the overall atmosphere of facilitating a sense of belongingness, participation, and also in the best interest of the students.
Thank you. We have one of our participants who's asking, how can we promote the diversity in research at the level of the field in addition to individual researcher level? For example, our empirical systematic review research found, one, the majority of the studies published in school psychology from 2018 to 2020 are based on U.S. participants, but with little information on SES, educational placement, disability, language, and religion. And they also found that in the review of the articles in 4 main journals in school psych from 2010 to 2021, that African American and Caucasian students are the most studied. Asian American students are the least studied. These are just some of their findings. These aspects of school psych research should be monitored for the goal of advancing diversity in research and services to all students. What are your thoughts? And this question comes from Hong Mi. And that was long, so if I need to go back to repeat.
I'm trying to read it in the chat. I can start a little bit.
It's in the chat. It is in the chat.
I think the first question about promoting diversity in research at the field of in the field, and then at the individual researcher level, goes specifically to diversifying our field and at schools and in academia, right? And so, like, if we're not in academia, then there's less opportunities to research, and so that really goes to the diversification of our field, where we're improving, but even when we're hiring more, there's still a lag because research takes, 6 months, a year and a half to, so there's like this lag. And so I think that will continue to be a challenge, but it's one that we're trying to fill in terms of diversifying the field. I mean, I can say in the last 5 to 7 years, I mean, we really have made efforts, and I see it when I go to conferences, but I do think that it takes some time. And then the same around, I think what was happening in research when we're not looking at variables like SES, language, religion, etc., is research with colorblind mentality, right? Like, if all students get this intervention and the intervention is done well, it shouldn't really matter if they're Black or brown, or if they're getting free or reduced lunch, or if they're, X, Y, and Z, because the intervention is going to be effective without looking at these covariates. And so I think that was a long time, what was happening for a long time, is this idea that, like, if the intervention is really effective, then all these other variables don't matter. And now we're realizing that, like, all these other variables do in fact matter. One, we can't be color or culture blind. We have to look at the interaction of all these variables and the additive or negative effect that they have on student experiences, so that we can be more intentional and targeted in how we support students and in our recommendations. I mean, I think for a long time, our recommendations you get to the recommendations and they're just like so broad, right? It's just like more research in this area, and we would just repeat the findings. I mean, I think that in our future directions in our discussion, we're all called to be much more descriptive in what we mean, and not be so broad and say more research in this area is needed, or these general findings suggest this. Like, I think that we all have to be more specific so that we can really push people to say that this is what specific groups of students need.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Vasquez?
Now, I would agree everything about everything she just said, but it really comes back down to our implicit biases. It comes to our political ideology, our cultural intelligence, our emotional intelligence, and how we interpret that within our classes. Having taught the psychology of poverty for the doctoral program in school psych, and also having taught the psychology of multiculturalism for over 15 years, it's fascinating how my mainstream faculty come to me for advice, but do very little reading on their own. So there is a bias toward some of those areas where we as people of color do. And I know that in school psych, because I have a doctorate in counseling psych with a minor in school psych, and we have less than 2% at the doctoral level of people of color within school psych, and not much better in counseling psych. It's improving. And I also noticed that very seldom do mainstream universities, Big 10, Pac-10, Ivy League private schools engage and team up with HBCUs, HSIs, and also TCUs. And so we need to create a sense of belongingness across research, across the spectrum. NSF is trying to do that now, and so is NIH. But we also need these mainstream ways of learning research. And I do agree, not all fits for all populations. There is a variability. That's how we got into the intersectionality of identities and looking at our populations and what does that mean when you are more than just one identity. But that has become a long, hard road. And with the backlashes happening across the country now, it's going to become even harder. So we as professors, as faculty, administrators, practitioners, and so forth, have to maintain and fight for those rights to continue growing and expanding what research really is versus having such a narrow focus.
Thank you both. We had another question. How do we address bias once a study is published? Who wants to tackle this one first?
I'm not sure I
And
understand.
a study was in parentheses. The question was, how do we address bias once? And we're guessing a study is published.
I think if I understand the question, I guess it's looking back. I mean, I think I've looked back at papers that I've written or manuscripts and research that I've done, and I feel like I've always done research in an ethical manner. But there's times when I look back and I always say, gosh, I wish I would have done it differently. Comparing groups, for example, or, looking at the discussion and feeling like, did I really challenge myself? Did I really challenge the field? And so I think that one of the things that's important about when you're doing research and conducting research is that generally we're looking at it over time. And when you look at your body of work, you should see it building on top of itself. If you look at all of your manuscripts and they all basically continue to tell the same story, then like how additive is it really? And so I think what becomes important is when you look at your body of work, or when we look at a body of work, we should see an upward trajectory of it getting better, of it becoming more critical, of us using different language, of us being more responsive. If I just keep replicating and changing variables, then again, I'm just perpetuating and saying, well, over 10 years, I'm still publishing the same thing. If I continue to say students with disabilities have lower perceptions of school climate and haven't done anything within that 10-year span, then why would I expect for things to be different? And so sometimes our own bias is how we interpret. Our bias comes out in the research questions that we ask, how we interpret those research questions. But I think that we have to challenge ourselves and look at our body of work and say, am I just replicating the same thing over and over? And if I am, then like, how am I actually contributing to the field, contributing to school site, contributing to the schools, most importantly?
Did you want to respond, Dr. Vasquez, or should we move to the next question? We do still have a few more minutes, so we still
Let's
have
go to
to.
the next question, but I totally agree with everything that was said there, though.
All right, great. This is an anonymous question. I've seen quite a bit of progress in my relatively brief time in school psych. In parentheses, I'm ECP now. However, BIPOC students, clinicians, and researchers continue to feel and be minoritized. We are still outside and have to watch our backs, knowing the influence of the, in quotation marks, old white boys club types. What can be done to build a more racially equitable future in our field?
That's a good question, and that's a tough question, because I've dealt with that. I'm sure many of us have dealt with that ourselves. One of the things you have to, the first thing you need to do is develop relationships that are supportive and have your best interests in mind as much as you have their best interests in mind. Number one. Number two, many of these things are coming about because people fear and wish to go back to the old days because they thought it was great in those days. It wasn't great, but we need to be truthful. Number three, even in our fields, because I've run into this, I don't know how many times, even when I went to APA, a lot of us are pretty cool, but look who I relate to, those of like mind. And so when I was in a very conservative area, I won't say where and how that experience went, but I learned a lot about why people think the way they do. Did I agree? No. But I really tested my emotional intelligence. It really challenged my implicit biases. And I really had to look at my own political ideology and what that meant in developing the kind of relationships necessary. Because see, it's not about us. When I used to keep talking about diversity, people right away, oh, you mean Black, Latino, Asian? Now I talk about having equitable communities, dealing with health disparities, dealing with educational disparities. Where are these pockets that are so powerful? And so when we resolve these issues, not only are we resolving for ourselves and our own populations, but for those that are related in the populations. When I taught the psychology of poverty, I don't know if people know this, but the largest percentage of homeless are the working poor, those that have full-time jobs and can't afford to have a place to live. And then when you look at the majority of population in those situations, you will see the people of color, many of us. But there's many of us that are not in that situation. And we have many of us within ourselves that, and this is why I say, learn about your biases, political ideology, and your emotional intelligence, because I have fellow Latinos who think very different and more mainstream. And I have others that are very more traditional. And I have other my African-American friends that are very, very conservative, and I have many of them that are very, very liberal. So it's fascinating trying to negotiate and balance these relationships in the best interests of those that need our most help. and that's our children in the schools. So when you ask that question, it takes a lot within oneself and also self-care to be able to work across all these different dimensions and make sense of them in such a way that it's the healthiest for those that you serve, but also keeping yourself sane in the process.
The only thing I'll add to that just really quickly is I think that what becomes important in this field is to build community and to build, to build community so that you have people who are like-minded and have similar goals and who have similar experiences to you, Black, brown, etc. Because it is really challenging. I mean, the work in and of itself is challenging. And then there are these additional barriers because you're Black, because you're a woman, because you live in a red state, because you live, and so I think it's really important to build community and to understand and think about what is your sphere of influence, right? And so what I've had to learn is like, I can't focus on things that are outside of my control. Like, this is what I have control over. And so what I've tried to really do strategically is focus on my sphere of influence, which is generally my research team, my students, the work that I do, personal things that are important, and focus on that and kind of drown out all the other noise, because I'd be lying if I said like, oh, it's going to be like, it's going to be fine. Like, it's not. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, students are struggling, people are struggling, like, but what has pushed me through is being able to call on a colleague, being able to call on a friend and be able to say like, this is what I'm struggling with, or get in a group and knowing that we're all like-minded and we're trying to move this work forward. Even if we start with our school or our district or 2 districts, like, that is my sphere of influence. And that's what I'll focus on. When you think about the whole state, and when you think about the whole district, when you think about your whole school, sometimes it can be overwhelming to the point where it's debilitating. And then I read my own research results sometimes and I'm like, this is depressing. And you have to really be thinking about like, you got to be able to brush yourself off and say, but how do I move forward? Because again, even if it's one school, one district, having a team is really, really important to that. It doesn't have to be a huge team. It can be 2-3 people, but it makes a difference building that community.
Absolutely. We only have a couple of minutes left, but we still have a good question that I would still like to pose to our presenters today. I think we've alluded to it earlier in terms of the changing climate these days. How do you address entering into research projects with systems where there are divisive concepts, laws, which severely limits our abilities to ask questions about multicultural concepts?
I don't know. I'm still working through that. I mean, I was in a blue state for a long time. And I see that there's another question that's around like that followed up with like building community. And so just to tie those two in around building community, but it's saying that it's still a challenge. It's a privilege, especially when folks are still in training. And then especially when BIPOC students are at PWIs. I was at a PWI for 9 years in a blue state, and now at an MSI, but still when I look at tenure track faculty, it's a small, like less than 3% when I look at Black and brown faculty. And so still some of the same challenges, but what I think becomes important, I don't know yet how to navigate in Georgia doing research around all of these words that they've banned. Right now, I've said, I don't care what they say, I'm going to continue my work, but I don't know, that means something different in the district. So just being really honest and transparent, I'm not sure what that looks like. Do I plan to stop doing the research? No, but am I having to think differently about it and what districts I work with in particular? Absolutely. And so it's something that I'm trying to navigate. I mean, because to me, like they're saying, don't use these words, use these words instead. And some people say, well, words don't matter. Words absolutely matter. If they didn't, people wouldn't spend so much time trying to say, don't use these words. And so what we're trying to focus on is schools and districts that allow us to advance the work forward, in the hopes that we're able to do that. And other schools and districts can see the benefit, and everything comes full circle eventually. But I mean but that's a challenge. And again, I think building community is really important when we're looking at BIPOC students, or we're at PWIs or even MSIs. Like at the graduate level, it looks very different than it does at the undergraduate level a lot of times. And so I think We have the school-based mental health grants that are really centered around recruiting and retaining minoritized students. I understand that it's a privilege to build community. I haven't always been able to build community, but I think that using NASP listservs, there's so many different, like NASP, we have the mentoring roundtable at NASP, we have BSPM, we have Schools Like Sisters, we have different groups where I think sometimes your community is not going to be the people who are next door to you. It's going to be somebody in a different state, somebody in a different school. And that in and of itself is a challenge, but that really is the reality, is that sometimes your community are not the people who are in the same city as you.
Yeah, I would have to agree. And I remember once with my I guess my better half, the other Dr. Vasquez, when we had entered a very, very confusing environment when we started talking about multiculturalism. And some of the statisticians and one of the faculty were very much, I won't tell you what state it was or what school it was, were very much against us. And we thought, oh my God, I even cried at night when I went home, but I went back again. And and it took time to show statistically what could be done, how it could be done. It also took time for the faculty to understand that there was within group differences, especially when we pointed out with the group. And it took time to develop a way of thinking and sharing with the faculty. By the way, the two members that were very much against, after the first year, and we never gave up, became some of our strongest allies and became spokespeople for us. But oh my God, the process of going through the challenges you had, and because many faculty, even faculty of color, watches and they'll stay on the sidelines because it's a lot. It's painful, it's emotional, but I can't think of a world would be like if we didn't try. But it is a price, and you do pay a price. I know, graduate programs, oh my God. So I'd have to agree with everything you said, but building those alliances and being open up to understand the other point of view, even though you may disagree or you may hate it, and how it is that you can work with that to be able to reach a point that you can reach the goals that you want. That becomes a real challenge.
Absolutely. And we really appreciate that you all keep working for the cause and keep moving us forward. It definitely does take a lot of community and building communities. And like you pointed out, sometimes it's not next door to you. It could be somewhere far away. But the beauty of these days that we didn't have back then is that we can be connected more now through virtual means and different ways. And another great example here is this Futures Conference, that we have a platform where we can continue this discussion. So we want to make sure to invite you to continue talking about these things, asking questions, and going to the Futures Conference webpage and adding your stories and your comments and your questions and discussions to the platform that we have. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. We appreciate your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Futures meeting. It should be in September. I don't know if we have a date yet. Lori or Tammy, I don't know if either one of you knows what day that next pillar discussion will be. But for now, thank you, Dr. Vasquez. Thank you, Dr. LaSalle. We really appreciate your help with this and answering the questions, and they were wonderful presentations. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.